Now, the situation of Carpatho-Rusyns, more specifically Lemkos, in post-communist Poland, because we're in the post-1989, post-communist world, more problematic, always problematic in the Lemko region, since all these people were deported, as we know, right after World War II. One of the main challenges that faced Poland's Lemko Rusyns is the fact that the group remained geographically dispersed between three areas, and I see that I didn't, alas, bring that map with you, so you're going to have to imagine previous maps that we had, not only the Lemko region itself, but also in two areas of Western Poland, two where the last remnants of them, roughly 30,000, were forcibly deported in 1947. And of course, that was in the opposite end of the country, the far west, either in the former southwestern province that had been German, Silesia, or directly in the middle of Poland, but in the western edge of it, in an area called Lubuskaya. Even within each of these areas, as I had mentioned when they were being forcibly deported in 1947, the Lemkos did not live in any concentration or large concentrations, deliberately dispersed throughout several villages and towns, so that they never would certainly not be a majority, and on top of it, a very small minority among the country's dominant population, the Poles. In an attempt to reach these geographically dispersed communities, the first Lemko Rusyn organizations that were created, the Lemko Society, we spoke of them, or that group, already established in 1989, the year of the great revolutions of 1989, encouraged different kind of cultural activity, and that depended on each of the regions. So we had a Lemko amateur theater in southwestern portion of Silesia, at a town called Legnica, which has become their kind of capital in exile, or main center. This is in the Germanic town of Liegnitz, which became Legnica in Polish. Had cultural days or meetings of Lemko culture in Pomerania, which is up in the north along the Black Sea, and also an international biennale based on the Venetian example of cultural events, an international biennale of Lemko Rusyn culture that was held actually back in the Lemko region in the town called Krynica. I believe Krynica was on your original map. Remember those days, way back in September? This Lemko society, Stowarzyszenie Lemkiw, whose base was in Legnica, established again, just to remind us, in 1989, and Legnica is in Silesia. The Lemko Society also created a committee on national education. Its goal was to promote codification of a Lemko variant of the Rusyn language, published several textbooks, culminating with the appearance of a standard grammar in the year 2000. And that appearance effectively marked the formal codification of the Lemko Rusyn language. We remember when we were talking about the impact of 1989, the creation of the World Congress of Rusyns, kind of similar demands or goals of each of the Carpatho-Rusyn communities, regardless of what country they lived in. And one of those major goals was, in fact, to codify a literary language. We are serious people. We need our own standardized literary language. And so this was done among Poland's Lemko Rusyns with the appearance of this standard grammar in the year 2000. Already in the 1990s, even before the grammar came out, there were classes in Lemko Rusyn in about 20 schools throughout all of these three regions, whether the Lemko region itself in the homeland or in the Western Poland, whether it be Silesia or Lubuskaya. And in 2001, after the standardized grammar appeared, the Polish Ministry of Education approved a program to teach the Lemko Rusyn language at the high school level. So government support, as in Slovakia. In order to train Lemko teaching cadres, you have grammars, you have schools, well, you need teachers. The following year, in 2002, a program in Lemko Rusyn philology was established at the Pedagogical University in Cracow. Now, similar to neighboring Slovakia, where there were also activities that we spoke about in our last lecture, also supported by the government. These efforts among Lemko Rusyns in Poland and other efforts to establish an institutional base for Lemko Rusyn culture were opposed by certain activists, also of Lemko origin, who argued that they themselves and the group, Lemko Rusyns as a whole, are part of the Ukrainian nationality. And so alongside already existing Ukrainian organizations in Poland, we have pro-Ukrainian Lemko activists who 1 year later, in 1990, create something called the Union of Lemkos in Poland. So now we have the Lemko Society, pro-Rusyn in orientation, and now we have the Union of Lemkos of pro-Ukrainian orientation. Symbolically, the Lemko Society, emphasizing its national orientation, was a founding member of the World Congress of Rusyns, while the Union of Lemkos became a founding member of the World Federation of Ukrainian Lemko organizations, which happen to be based in the United States. This rivalry between supporters of these two organizations, that is the pro-Rusyn Lemko Society, the pro-Ukrainian Union of Lemkos, was first evident at those annual summer Vatra festivals. Remember, this began already well in communist Poland in 1983, where they got together on a mountainside, as I said, in the Woodstock variant or similar type situation, to talk about who they are, where they come from, have cultural programs. So we had this Vatra festival helping to create a sense of pride in Lemko Rusyns. The original organizers of this festival were actually of Rusyn orientation, but beginning in 1990, the Vatra in the homeland was now taken over and run by the Union of Lemkos. And as a result of that, it was rapidly transformed into an ostentatiously Ukrainian event at which participants from Ukraine, including in 1 year, the president of Ukraine, traveled all the way to Poland to this hillside, literally, to be among the prominent guests. Now, the pro-Rusyn Lemko Society and the pro-Ukrainian Union of Lemkos struggled against each other to gain control, just like the churches, of property. And in this particular case, the building of the Ruska Bursa, we spoke about this going back to the late 19th century, before World War I, then during the interwar years. There was the last of them in the town of Gorlice. Again, it's called the Ruska Bursa, which effectively was a residence for and cultural center for students attending from these Lemko villages, a gymnasium, senior high school in the town of Gorlice, opened already under the Austrians before World War I, closed during the war, opened again for a while under the Poles, closed during World War II, then opened again, not really opened again, but the building was made to be controlled by the city of Gorlice during communist times. They effectively owned the building, but originally belonged to Rusyn organizations. And so both the pro-Rusyn Lemko Association and the pro-Ukrainian Union of Lemkos struggled with each other to legally get back this property, because after the revolutions of 1989, we had the principle of property restitution. All of the property that was nationalized and taken by the communist regime, including private houses, including businesses, including church, were now able, after 1989, to be given back to their original owners. So who owns this Ruska Bursa building, which was taken over by the communist authorities, specifically the city authorities of Gorlice? There was a right to giving it back to whom? So both these pro-Rusyn and pro-Ukrainian organizations struggle to get it back. A long court battle ensues, challenges for ownership between these two organizations. Until in 2009, the pro-Ukrainian, the pro-Rusyn Lemko Association, or the pro-Rusyn activists, get control of this building. And then, now that it is in the hands, it's called the Ruska Bursa Society. They sponsor cultural events. They have a permanent exhibit of Lemko ethnography. The organization also began to publish a bilingual Russian-Polish scholarly journal called the Rycznik Ruskiej Bursy, and then a radio station called Lemko FM, broadcast actually 24 hours. Now, despite the achievements of both the Lemko Society and the Ruska Bursa, also other organizations promoting Lemko Rusyn culture and language, there are still several matters that continue to cloud relations with the larger society in which they live, and that is Poland. And what are those matters? Well, the first of these has to do with the Vistula operation that we spoke about last time, or one of our times. This was the last phase of the deportation, forced deportation of Lemkos from their homeland, carried out by the Polish government in 1947, and the disastrous impact that it had on displacing people. Efforts by Lemko organizations to obtain a formal apology from the Polish government began, actually have not been successful to this day. It's interesting, the Polish Senate agreed to do it, but not the lower house of parliament, the Polish parliament. Sort of reminds one of the situation among the Armenians in Turkey, or Turkey just refuses to recognize that this was a genocide directed against Armenians and won't issue any kind of apology. So similarly, the Polish government has taken this position. Nor have the other thing, aside from just an apology, they're not asking for any more, but the other thing, their property was taken away from them. So, you know, there are requests for property restitution, in particular control of forests that were lost by families after the deportation. That hasn't been resolved either. An even more serious consequence of this forced deportation of 1947 and the dispersal of the Lemko Rusyns in various parts of southwestern, west central, and even some up in the Balkan, northwestern Poland, has been the phenomenon of national assimilation. The vast majority of individuals whose parents or grandparents were or are Lemkos, the vast majority to this day actually have become Poles. This reality was graphically revealed in the census of 2001. That was the first time since World War II that questions of national or ethnic identity and native language were asked on the Polish census forms. It began in 1991 in Slovakia. It didn't start in Poland until 2001, 10 years later, but it did. And it goes, in preparation for this, Lemko cultural activists had assumed that there would be anywhere between 35,000, which is roughly the number that would disperse, and then after demographic growth, could anywhere between 35,000 and 60,000 Lemko Rusyns living in Poland. But the 2001 census indicated only 5,500 persons of Lemko Rusyn national identity, about an equal number of families of Lemko mother tongue as well, declared that they were of Lemko Rusyn background. Now, that figure in 2001 was only 5,500. 10 years later, it moved to 10,000. And in 2021, it moved up again. So, you know, things did change in a positive direction, but clearly has still not reached the minimal number of 30,000 one would have thought. But of course, the census takes place. There are people, certainly true, that Lemko Rusyns exist and that they are officially recognized and do receive support for cultural activity from the Polish government. It is also true that the Lemkos have solicited sympathy among fellow Poles living in Poland. And actually, either through television programs, other media coverage, Polish society as a whole has learned about the, for them, exotic culture of a few Lemkos who still manage to live in one of Poland's most popular tourist destinations, aside from everything else, these mountains, various ranges of the Carpathian mountains in southeastern Poland. The question does remain, however, whether Lemko Rusyns in whichever three regions of Poland they live, the Lemko region, Silesia, West Central Poland, whether they can survive the normal, in a sense, and overwhelming social pressure to assimilate fully with Polish society. The question, like for any stateless national minority, remains open. we have now completed looking at the status of Carpatho-Rusyns in each of the three major areas of historic Carpathian Rus, that is, Subcarpathian Rus within Ukraine, the Prešov region within Slovakia, and the Lemko region in Poland. Of course, there are also Carpatho-Rusyns living in northeastern Hungary, in a small little number here in north-central Romania. There are also diasporas in the Czech Republic, the diaspora of Lemko Rusyns who were deported to the east in Ukraine, a few number in the Czech Republic, in particular Prague, but numerically the largest of the diaspora communities has always been and still remains that of Carpatho-Rusyns living in North America, particularly in the United States. We spoke about that phenomenon before World War I, especially since that community had an impact on political developments after World War I, and we've left them, but today just a few more words to round that picture out. We saw already before World War I how that community created various secular organizations, in particular various churches, different jurisdictions and denominations, Orthodox, Greek, Catholic. These many secular organizations and different church jurisdictions, dating in one way back to the World War I era, continued to function in the interwar years and after World War II. However, they steadily lost their national character. The reasons for that had to do with developments in the European homeland, as well as a change in attitude among the secular and religious organizations themselves toward the whole question of the national identity of their members. In 1945, this is the World War II comes to an end. Actually, a Carpatho-Rusyn Congress, as it was called, was convened in Munhall, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh, because that's the center of the Carpatho-Rusyn world in North America. So already in the last year of the war, we have this Carpatho-Rusyn Congress, which was convened by the leadership of the Greek Catholic Union, which was always the biggest and most influential organization among Carpatho-Rusyns in the United States. It goes back to 1892. So they convened this Congress. The Congress drafts a petition, submits it to the United States government, also to the newly founded United Nations, which was just meeting in San Francisco, and then eventually came into being. And what was the gist of their petition? Well, it protested against the annexation of Subcarpathian Rus to the Soviet Union, which of course we saw was part of the changes after World War II. And also, aside from just the simple annexation to the Soviet Union, protested against the Soviet policy of Ukrainianization. This petition of the Carpatho-Rusyn Congress in Munhall, a few subsequent protests, 1951, even as late as 1964, on the part of that Congress and other Rusyn American organizations, in complete contrast to what the situation was after World War I. These protests then had no impact at all on the European homeland. But at least they fit in with the overall American foreign policy during what came to be known soon after 45 as the Cold War, and in which American government, public, increasingly critical of communist rule and Soviet expansionism. It was also during the Cold War years, late 40s, for all intents and purposes until the mid-80s, that the tradition of close contact between Carpatho-Rusyn Americans and their family and friends in Carpathian Rus, whether through letters or personal visits, during this period virtually came to a complete end, halt. Because the Soviet Union and its communist satellite countries, including Slovakia and Poland, put a stop to travel and even postal contact of its citizens with that dastardly capitalist West. In effect, Carpatho-Rusyn American organizations no longer had any political role to play, and the community as a whole was cut off from the European homeland. And aside from that, during the Cold War, lasting well into the early 80s, communist-dominated media in Europe described most Carpatho-Rusyn American organizations as enemies of socialism, while in turn American society was increasingly suspicious of people within the United States who traced their origins to lands ruled by those feared communist Russians, the commies. I mean, this was the era of McCarthyism. And so you didn't want to be associated, with that part of the world if you were a true full-blooded American. These kind of attitudes only encouraged the otherwise natural tendency of younger people of Carpatho-Rusyn ancestry to adapt quickly, if they hadn't already, and to assimilate fully into American society, and to reject the language and eventually any association with the European Carpathian homeland of their parents and their grandparents. Symbolic of this change was the gradual introduction of English into the previously vibrant Rusyn American press. Destructive and costly rivalries between various Eastern Rite Church jurisdiction only complicated matters. Confusing explanations about the identity of a small ethnic group without its own independent state. Young people, in rare occasions, ask their parents or grandparents, where did we come from? Who are we? I don't know. We don't have a country. Oh, we're from Slovakia or Czechoslovakia. Well, some of our parents say we're Carpatho-Rusyns, then we're from Russia. Oh, we don't want to be associated with that. Very rarely someone would say Ukrainian. No answer, really. And there was this, as I said, generally negative association of East Slavs in American society because during the Cold War, that was all communism and they were the enemy. All of these factors that by the 1970s had led to the virtual end in the United States of any community that could be defined as specifically Carpatho-Rusyn. In an attempt to overcome what could only be characterized as ethno-cultural nihilism, It's almost as if these people had a lobotomy and their memory was taken away from them. In the 70s, an attempt to counteract that, a small group of university-trained young intellectuals with no formal allegiance to any existing religious or secular organization formed in 1978 something called the Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center. We're in America now, so let's forget. So we'll use this board as if we're in another. That's Europe, this is North America. The Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center. (1978). In one sense, this center was responding to the so-called ethnic revival that was taking place in the United States. It came to be known as the Roots movement. It was spearheaded by Afro-Americans, by American blacks. Famous book by Alex Haley called Roots was then transformed into a week-long television series in which virtually the whole country was watching. It was also coinciding with a movement throughout American society that was in conjunction with the 1976 bicentennial celebration of the United States. So here are the African Americans telling their story, and the American government is asking other peoples to tell their story. And Carpatho-Rusyns get involved. In 1978, this Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center begins publishing a quarterly magazine called the Carpatho-Rusyn American. It distributes scholarly but readable, note the difference, publications, organizing conferences and lectures, all with the goal to make clear to Americans of Carpatho-Rusyn descent, as well as to the American public at large, that Carpatho-Rusyns are not Russians, not Ukrainians, not Slovaks, not anything else, but rather a distinct Slavic nationality, Carpatho-Rusyns. Some segments of the Carpatho-Rusyn American community responded to the message about the cultural and national distinctiveness of their ancestral heritage. They began to establish folk ensembles, dance groups in various parts of the northeastern United States, where we know they were concentrated. But nonetheless, this kind of hesitant ethno-national awakening, stimulated by the Roots movement, the African American Roots movement, it in many ways unfolded in isolation. What do I mean by in isolation? Well, this is because the European homeland was still ruled by communist regimes, regimes which continued to ban the very idea that Carpatho-Rusyns may be a distinct nationality. All this seemed to suggest that Carpatho-Rusyn Americans, at least those very few who had some sense of their unique ancestral heritage, they were really nothing but, in a sense, the last Mohegans, speaking on behalf of a people that no longer existed in its place of origin, that is Carpathian Rus. Of course, in general, you should know that one should be very careful in making assumptions about the future. based on what we know about present conditions. Especially since at least now we know that the present in the 1980s ended with the year 1989 and the radical transformation of Central and Eastern Europe. What was seemingly gone forever, the Carpatho-Rusyn people, was like a phoenix revived in the wake of the revolutions of 1989. How then did that new reality have an impact on this diaspora in the United States? Well, these revolutions of 1989 worked in the following way. After over half a century of separation, which I've just been noting, the result of World War II, the subsequent restrictions against contacts with the West imposed by communist rule. After 1989, Carpatho-Rusyn Americans were finally able to reconnect with families and friends in the European homeland of their parents and their grandparents. The discovery after 1989 that Carpatho-Rusyns actually still existed in Central Europe galvanized an increasing number of Americans to rediscover, or more likely to discover for the first time, that they no longer needed to associate their ancestral heritage with an existing country and therefore have to identify as Slovak or Russian or Polish or Ukrainian, but rather with what their ancestral heritage really was, Carpatho-Rusyn. Is your screen more funny than me, sir? Because you're laughing, and I'm speaking seriously, so you must be enjoying something on your screen. I hope it's good. Alongside the already existing Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center, comprised of a few academics engaged since the 1970s in scholarly and popular educational activity, there did arise several grassroots membership organizations, the largest and most prominent of which has been something called the Carpatho-Rusyn Society, not the same as the Research Center, which came into being in 1994. In 1994, so after the revolutions of 1989. It was founded with a base in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the ultimate center of the Carpatho-Rusyn community in North America. It established 9 branches throughout the United States. And through these branches, the society began to sponsor lectures about Carpatho-Rusyns. They participated in cultural festivals, promoted contacts through the media, including a Carpatho-Rusyn radio program and a quarterly magazine called the New Rusyn Times, organized annual study tours to the main areas of Carpathian Rus, the homeland. So you're galvanizing at a grassroots level a community that ceased to exist. In a sense, you're recreating it. Notice the term recreate. The Carpatho-Rusyn community in Canada, much smaller, but it also experienced somewhat of a revival. There was a Lemko association in Canada dating way back to 1920. In fact, the Lemko Association in the United States was actually formed in Canada, in Winnipeg, Canada, in 1929. And then it only moved to the United States a couple of years later. However, in Canada, by the end of the 20th century, became, for all intents and purposes, moribund. At the same time, however, there were a few hundred families that left war-torn Yugoslavia in the mid-90s, and they went specifically to Canada, set up community life, in particular in the provinces of Ontario and Saskatchewan, but not here in Toronto, but rather in the West. Kitchener was their center, and then in Saskatchewan, somewhere out in the plains, Brattleboro, I think, is the name of the town. And that organization conducted social gatherings, language classes for their children, periodical publications. Now, in the wake of the changes in the European homeland, as we know, brought about by the revolutions of 1989, Carpatho-Rusyns in the United States and Canada renewed a kind of public advocacy work that had characterized their communities during the quarter century between the close of World War I in 1918 and the end of World War II in 1945. They were quite active in communication with the homeland. And certainly, as we know, during 1919 with the American government, which helped to change the political framework of Europe. And so now, this kind of activity is being renewed, advocacy activity, political and cultural in nature, implemented at both the organizational and the individual level. For example, Carpatho-Rusyns from North America have played an increasingly prominent role in the work of the World Congress of Rusyns, based in Europe, ever since its establishment in 1991. And responding to the programmatic goals of the World Congress, delegations of Carpatho-Rusyns from the United States and Canada initiated meetings in Washington, D.C., with embassies of all countries where Carpatho-Rusyns live, as well as with diplomatic representatives from the European Union and the Vatican. The issues of most concern have been, one, the refusal of Ukraine to recognize Carpatho-Rusyns as a distinct nationality. The second is the Slovakization policies of the Greek Catholic Eparchy of Prešov in Slovakia. The third was the reluctance of the government of Slovakia to provide adequate support for Carpatho-Rusyn cultural and educational institutions during a brief period of a right-wing Slovak government in the 1990s. And also of concern, the reluctance of the government of Poland, as I said, to issue an apology for the forced deportation of Lemkos during the 1947 Vistula operation, and also to assist Lemko Rusyns in regaining lost property. Some of these concerns have been brought to the attention of the United States government, its congressional leaders, as well as to the office of Ukraine's ombudsman in Kiev. And then there is direct assistance to the Carpatho-Rusyn homeland that began in the 1990s, consisting of humanitarian aid, funding for cultural and educational activity. You know, you're in the post-Soviet, post-communist transition period. Things were not particularly good in the homeland countries, and certainly in the peripheral areas of those homeland countries where Carpatho-Rusyns live, whether eastern Slovakia or far western Ukraine, southeastern Poland. And so several tons of medical supplies and equipment sent to hospitals in Transcarpathia, funds distributed to assist educational projects among the Voyevodinian Rusyns after the terrible civil war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in Croatia, which hit directly Carpatho-Rusyn villages in Croatia. Publications from North America sent to the new Russian language university departments, whether in Prešov or in Cracow or in Nyíregyháza in Hungary. Also funds to support research projects and conferences at those institutions. Among the leading donors in this regard was actually a businessman from here in Toronto, in Canada, a man named Stephen Cheba, a merchant banker of Carpatho-Rusyn ancestry. He establishes something called the World Academy of Russian Culture. He establishes a Carpatho-Rusyn Studies Fellowship at the University of Toronto, and an annual Alexander Duchnovich Prize. We know who Alexander Duchnovich is, and this is a prize for the best literary work written in the Russian language. And of particular importance was the Russian extracurricular school program begun in Ukraine's Transcarpathian region, funding exclusively from North America. And so, on this topic, it is certainly clear that the revolutions of 1989, the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in its satellite countries have made possible ongoing contacts among Carpatho-Rusyns in every country where they live, whether it be in Europe or in North America. It is also clear that these mutually beneficial contacts have enhanced the vitality and the quality of what, since 1989, has come to be known as the Third Carpatho-Rusyn National Awakening.